What if the young executive who stepped in to defend a humble janitor from workplace bullying never knew he was actually protecting the father who gave him up 23 years ago? What if one moment of courage in a corporate hallway would unravel a secret that could either heal two broken hearts or destroy the carefully built life they both cherished? This is a story about blood, belonging, and the invisible threads that connect us even when we don't know they exist. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Meridian Industries headquarters in downtown Seattle. 23-year-old Michael Chun adjusted his navy blue tie as he stepped out of the executive elevator onto the 42nd floor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Fresh out of Stanford with an MBA and armed with the confidence that came from being the son of the company's founder, Michael carried himself with the easy assurance of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. His corner office overlooked Elliott Bay, where cargo ships moved like distant toys against the steel-gray water. 3 floors below, David Martinez pushed his cleaning cart through the gleaming corridors of the 39th floor. At 45, his hands were weathered from years of manual labor, his shoulders slightly stooped from countless hours bent over mops and vacuum cleaners. The navy blue uniform hung loose on his lean frame, and his employee badge, slightly faded, read simply D. Martinez, Custodial Services. What the badge didn't reveal was the PhD in engineering gathering dust in a storage unit across town, or the brilliant mind that had once designed water purification systems for disaster relief organizations around the world. David had been working the night shift at Meridian for 18 months, a job that allowed him to support his teenage daughter Maria while staying invisible in a world that had once celebrated his innovations. The transition from respected engineer to overnight janitor hadn't been by choice. A whistleblowing incident at his previous company had effectively blacklisted him from his profession, leaving him with few options and a daughter who needed stability more than his wounded pride needed restoration. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now cleaned the offices of a tech company whose water management division used principles he had helped pioneer years earlier. But David had learned to find dignity in honest work, even when that work required him to empty trash cans in conference rooms, where million-dollar decisions were made by people half his age. Michael's morning routine was as predictable as it was efficient. Coffee from the executive break room, a quick review of overnight emails, and a walk through the development floors to check on his team's progress. As the newly appointed Director of Innovation, he took his responsibilities seriously, even if some employees whispered that his rapid promotion had more to do with his last name than his qualifications. Michael was determined to prove them wrong, working longer hours than necessary and treating every project as if the company's future depended on it. The building itself was a testament to modern corporate architecture, all glass and steel reaching toward the sky like a crystalline mountain. The Chun family had built Meridian from a small software startup into a multinational corporation specializing in environmental technology. Michael's adoptive father, Robert Chen, had founded the company 25 years earlier with nothing but a revolutionary idea for pollution monitoring and an unshakable belief in the power of innovation to solve the world's problems. Robert had always been open about Michael's adoption, telling him from an early age that he had been chosen, that love was what made a family, not genetics. Michael had grown up grateful for his privileged life and proud of the Chun name, never feeling the need to search for his biological parents. As far as he was concerned, Robert Chun was his father in every way that mattered, and Meridian Industries was his birthright. David's workday typically ended at 6 in the morning, just as the early employees began arriving. He preferred it that way, finishing his rounds before the building, filled with the bustling energy of corporate life. His routine was methodical and thorough. Conference rooms first, then executive offices, finally the common areas. He took pride in his work, leaving every surface spotless and every wastebasket empty. On this particular Tuesday morning, David was running slightly behind schedule. Maria had called just before his shift ended, excited about making the honor roll at Roosevelt High School. The pride in her voice had made him forget about time for a few precious minutes, as they talked about her plans for college and her dreams of becoming a doctor. By the time he finished his rounds on the 39th floor, the building was already beginning to stir with the arrival of the early shift. As David pushed his cart toward the service elevator, the sound of raised voices echoed from around the corner. He slowed his pace instinctively, years of maintaining a low profile having taught him to avoid confrontations whenever possible. But the voices grew louder, and he recognized the cruel laughter that often accompanied workplace bullying. "Look what we have here," came a voice dripping with disdain. "Our midnight scholar burning the midnight oil again." David rounded the corner to see three men in expensive suits surrounding someone near the water cooler. The speaker was Bradley Morrison, a senior vice president known for his expensive haircuts and his talent for making others feel small. Flanking him were two of his associates, Marcus Webb and Jonathan Price, both middle management types who had learned that aligning themselves with Morrison's cruelty was a path to advancement. Their target was James Sullivan, a soft-spoken accountant in his 50s who worked late most nights to support his wife's medical treatments. James clutched a coffee cup with trembling hands, his eyes fixed on the floor as Morrison continued his verbal assault. "Tell me, Jimmy," Morrison said, using the diminutive name like a weapon, "did you finally figure out those quarterly projections? Or are you going to need another extension? Maybe we should get you a tutor. I hear they have programs for people with learning disabilities." Webb and Price chuckled on cue, their laughter sharp and ugly in the pristine hallway. James's face flushed red, but he said nothing, which only seemed to encourage Morrison's cruelty. David felt his jaw tighten as he watched the scene unfold. He had witnessed Morrison's bullying before, had seen how the man seemed to take pleasure in humiliating those he perceived as weak or vulnerable. But David had always kept walking, his head down, reminded himself that he couldn't afford to get involved. He had Maria to think about, bills to pay, a fragile stability that could be shattered by a single complaint to human resources. But something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the way James's hands shook, or the genuine cruelty in Morrison's voice, or simply the fact that David had spent too many years watching injustice unfold without acting. Whatever the reason, he found himself stepping forward instead of walking away. "Excuse me," David said quietly, his voice cutting through Morrison's laughter. The three men turned toward him with expressions of surprise and annoyance. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he took in David's uniform and cleaning cart. "What do you want, janitor?" Morrison's voice carried the particular kind of contempt reserved for those he considered beneath his notice. David kept his expression neutral, his voice steady. "I need to clean this area." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If you could move your meeting somewhere else, I'd appreciate it. It was a polite fiction, a way to break up the confrontation without directly challenging Morrison's authority. But Morrison was in no mood to be diplomatic. "Your cleaning can wait," Morrison snapped. "We're having an important conversation here. Something you wouldn't understand." David glanced at James, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable, then back at Morrison. "Looks more like harassment to me." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Webb and Price exchanged glances, suddenly unsure of themselves. Morrison's face darkened with anger. "What did you just say to me?" Before David could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the direction of the executive elevator. "Michael." Sean appeared around the corner, his expression shifting from casual morning routine to sharp attention as he took in the scene before him. Michael's eyes moved quickly from Morrison's aggressive posture to James's obvious distress to the janitor standing calmly beside his cleaning cart. The dynamic was immediately clear, and Michael felt a familiar surge of protective anger that he had inherited along with his sense of justice. "Is there a problem here?" Michael's voice carried the authority that came naturally to him, the unquestioned confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. Morrison's demeanor changed instantly, the cool arrogance replaced by professional deference. "Michael, good morning. We were just having a discussion about project deadlines." Michael looked at James, whose relief at the interruption was obvious, then at the janitor, who maintained his calm composure despite being clearly outmatched by the corporate hierarchy surrounding him. "It didn't sound like a discussion," Michael said evenly. "It sounded like three grown men intimidating a colleague." Morrison's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "I think you might be misunderstanding the situation." Michael stepped closer, his presence shifting the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "I don't think I am. James, are you all right?" James nodded quickly, clutching his coffee cup like a lifeline. "Yes, sir." "Thank you." Michael turned his attention to David, noting the dignity in his posture despite the obvious inequality of the situation. "And you are?" "David Martinez, Custodial Services," David replied simply. "Mr. Martinez was trying to do his job," Michael said, his gaze returning to Morrison with unmistakable displeasure. "And from what I observed, he was also the only person here showing any professional courtesy." Morrison's face flushed, but he managed to maintain his composure. "Of course, we'll move our discussion to my office." "I think you've said enough for one morning," Michael replied coldly. "James, why don't you head back to your desk?" "And, gentlemen," he addressed Webb and Price, "I'm sure you have work to do elsewhere." The group dispersed quickly, Morrison shooting a venomous look at David as he passed. When they were alone, Michael turned to David with an expression of genuine respect. "Thank you for standing up for James," Michael said. "That took courage." David shrugged slightly. "Just seemed like the right thing to do." There was something in the janitor's voice, a quiet strength that resonated with Michael in a way he couldn't quite explain. Looking at David more closely, Michael noticed the intelligence in his eyes, the careful way he chose his words, the dignity he maintained despite his circumstances. "I'm Michael Chen," he said, extending his hand. David hesitated for just a moment before accepting the handshake. "David Martinez, and I know who you are, Mr. Chen." The handshake lasted a moment longer than necessary, and both men felt something unexpected pass between them. For Michael, it was a sense of recognition he couldn't name, a feeling that this encounter meant more than a simple workplace intervention. For David, it was the dangerous stirring of hope, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was still goodness in the world that could see past uniforms and job titles to the person underneath. "Call me Michael," the younger man said with a slight smile. "And thank you again. Not everyone would have gotten involved." David nodded, already reaching for his cleaning cart. "Have a good day, Michael." As David pushed his cart toward the service elevator, Michael watched him go with a curious mixture of admiration and something else he couldn't quite identify. There had been something familiar about the man's presence, something that made Michael want to continue the conversation, to learn more about the janitor who had shown more integrity in 5 minutes than Morrison had displayed in years. The elevator doors closed behind David, and Michael stood alone in the hallway, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows and painting everything in shades of gold. He couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter had been more than chance, that some invisible thread had drawn him to this moment, for reasons he didn't yet understand. In the service elevator, David leaned against the wall and allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. For the first time in months, he had acted like the man he used to be, the one who couldn't stand by and watch injustice unfold. It felt good, even if it might have consequences. As the elevator descended toward the ground floor, David thought about the young executive who had stepped in to support him. There had been something about Michael Chun that struck him as familiar, though he couldn't place why. Maybe it was simply the young man's sense of justice, his willingness to use his privilege to protect others. It reminded David of the idealistic engineer he had once been, back when he believed that doing the right thing would always be enough. The elevator reached the ground floor, and David pushed his cart out into the maintenance area where he would clean and store his equipment before heading home. His shift was over, but the encounter in the hallway had left him with a strange energy, a feeling that something important had begun. Neither Michael nor David could have known that their chance meeting was actually the first chapter of a story that had begun 23 years earlier, in a small hospital room where a young man named David Martinez had made the most difficult decision of his life. They couldn't have known that the invisible thread connecting them was stronger than coincidence, deeper than workplace courtesy, and more powerful than either of them could imagine. As the morning progressed and the building filled with the usual bustle of corporate life, two men went about their separate routines, unaware that they had just taken the first step toward a truth that would change everything they thought they knew about family, sacrifice, and the enduring power of love. The reputation of Bradley Morrison spread through Meridian Industries like a virus, infecting every department he touched with his particular brand of toxic leadership. 3 days after the hallway incident, David Martinez learned just how vindictive a man in a position of power could be when his authority was challenged in front of witnesses. The first sign of trouble came during David's routine Thursday night shift. Instead of his usual assignment covering the 39th and 40th floors, he found a revised schedule taped to his locker that reassigned him to the basement storage areas and mechanical rooms. The change was presented as a temporary adjustment due to staffing needs, but David recognized it for what it was: punishment disguised as administrative necessity. The basement of Meridian Industries was a labyrinth of concrete corridors, humming machinery, and forgotten storage rooms that smelled of dust and industrial cleaning solutions. It was work that needed doing, but it was also work that kept David as far away from the executive floors as possible. More importantly, it was work that paid 20% less than his previous assignment, a detail buried in the fine print of his new assignment paperwork. David accepted the reassignment without complaint, understanding that fighting it would only make his situation worse. He had Maria's college fund to consider, and steady employment, even at reduced wages, was better than no employment at all. But the injustice of it burned in his chest as he pushed his cart through the fluorescent-lit corridors of the building's forgotten underground spaces. Michael Chun noticed David's absence from the executive floors after just 2 days. At first, he assumed the janitor had been assigned to a different shift, but casual inquiries to the building management staff revealed the reassignment. When Michael learned about the pay reduction that accompanied the transfer, his suspicion crystallized into certainty that Morrison was behind the change. The confirmation came during a department meeting the following Tuesday, when Morrison made an offhand comment about the importance of keeping disruptive elements away from senior staff. The comment was delivered with Morrison's characteristic smirk, and Michael felt his temper flare at the obvious reference to David's intervention on James Sullivan's behalf. Michael's sense of justice, inherited from his adoptive father along with his position at the company, wouldn't allow the situation to stand. But he also understood that corporate politics required finesse. A direct confrontation with Morrison would likely result in David losing his job entirely, which would help no one. Instead, Michael decided to take a more strategic approach. Robert Chun had built Meridian Industries on principles of integrity and respect for all employees, values that he had instilled in Michael from childhood. The company's employee handbook contained strong policies against retaliation and workplace harassment, policies that Robert insisted be enforced at every level of the organization. Michael knew that if he could document Morrison's retaliation against David, he would have grounds to take the matter to human resources and, if necessary, to his father directly. But first, Michael needed to understand more about David Martinez. The janitor's quiet dignity and obvious intelligence had made a lasting impression, and Michael found himself curious about the man's background. A discreet inquiry to Human Resources revealed basic employment information. David had been hired 18 months earlier, had an exemplary work record, and listed previous experience in facilities management. But there were gaps in his employment history that suggested a story more complex than his current position indicated. Michael's investigation was interrupted by an unexpected discovery. While reviewing quarterly reports in his office, he found a folder of old engineering proposals that had been misfiled among his current projects. The proposals dated back 5 years and dealt with water purification systems for disaster relief operations. The lead engineer on the project was listed as Dr. David Martinez, Ph.D., Environmental Engineering, University of Washington. The photograph, clipped to the personnel file, showed a younger version of the janitor Michael had met in the hallway, dressed in a suit and tie, standing beside a prototype water filtration unit. The biography listed impressive credentials, advanced degrees, patents for water treatment innovations, awards for humanitarian engineering work in developing countries. Michael stared at the photograph for a long moment, trying to reconcile the accomplished engineer in the picture with the man pushing a cleaning cart through the building's basement. What had happened to bring Dr. David Martinez from designing life-saving technology to cleaning office buildings? Michael's curiosity deepened into genuine concern as he realized that Morrison's retaliation was not just unfair, but was also targeting someone whose contributions to society far exceeded the vice president's own questionable achievements. The answer to Michael's questions came from an unexpected source. James Sullivan, still grateful for the intervention that had saved him from Morrison's bullying, approached Michael during lunch with information he thought might be relevant. James had done some research of his own, motivated by curiosity about the janitor who had been willing to stand up to corporate bullies on his behalf. James had discovered newspaper articles from 3 years earlier, detailing a whistleblowing case involving environmental safety violations at a major engineering firm. Dr. David Martinez had been the whistleblower, exposing his company's practice of falsifying water quality reports for municipal treatment plants. The revelations had prevented a potential public health crisis, but had also resulted in David being blacklisted from the engineering industry. Corporate attorneys had ensured that while David couldn't be prosecuted for his revelations, he also couldn't find employment in his field. The articles painted a picture of a man who had sacrificed his career to protect public safety, only to find himself abandoned by an industry that valued loyalty to corporate interests over ethical responsibility. Michael read the articles with growing anger and admiration, understanding finally why a brilliant engineer was working as a janitor and why he had been willing to risk his job to defend a stranger. Armed with this knowledge, Michael began planning his strategy to help David, but his plans were complicated by Morrison's escalating campaign of harassment. The vice president had apparently decided that reassignment wasn't sufficient punishment for David's insubordination and had begun looking for ways to terminate his employment entirely. The opportunity Morrison was waiting for presented itself during David's 3rd week in the basement assignment. A valuable piece of computer equipment went missing from a storage room that David had been assigned to clean. The theft was reported to building security, and Morrison immediately suggested that the new custodial worker with access to the area should be investigated. David learned about the accusation when he was called to a meeting with Human Resources. On a Friday afternoon, the HR representative, a nervous woman named Patricia Hoffman, explained that a thorough investigation would be conducted, but that David would be suspended without pay pending the outcome. The implication was clear. David was being treated as the prime suspect in the theft. The injustice of the situation was crushing. David had spent 20 years building a reputation for integrity, only to have it destroyed by corporate politics and petty revenge. Worse, the suspension meant that he wouldn't be able to make the rent payment on the small apartment he shared with Maria. College applications were due in 6 months, and Maria's dreams of becoming a doctor suddenly seemed impossibly distant. David cleaned out his locker that evening with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout his employment at Meridian. He left no dramatic protests or angry words, understanding that any emotional response would only be used against him. But as he walked through the parking garage toward his 15-year-old Honda Civic, David felt the weight of accumulated injustices threatening to crush his spirit. Michael learned about David's suspension through James Sullivan, who had overheard Morrison bragging about finally getting rid of the troublesome janitor. Michael's anger at the news was immediate and intense, but he forced himself to think strategically. David's situation required more than righteous indignation. It required evidence and careful planning. Michael spent the weekend researching corporate investigation procedures and employee rights, preparing for a confrontation that he knew would define not just David's future, but his own sense of integrity. He also did something that would have seemed unthinkable just 2 weeks earlier. He drove to the address listed in David's employment file, a modest apartment complex in Beacon Hill, with the intention of offering his support to a man he barely knew but deeply respected. The apartment building was a 3-story structure built in the 1970s, showing its age but maintained with obvious care. Michael climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor and knocked on apartment 2B, uncertain of what he would say, but certain that he couldn't stand by while an innocent man was destroyed by corporate vindictiveness. David opened the door wearing jeans and a faded University of Washington t-shirt, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness when he recognized his visitor. Behind him, Michael could see a teenage girl with dark hair and intelligent eyes, doing homework at a small kitchen table. The apartment was small but clean, furnished with obvious care and attention to making the most of limited space. "Mr. Chun," David said, his voice carefully neutral. "This is unexpected. I heard about the suspension," Michael replied. "I wanted you to know that not everyone believes Morrison's accusations." David's expression softened slightly, but he didn't invite Michael inside. "I appreciate that, but there's nothing you can do. The investigation will either clear me or it won't." "Actually, there is something I can do," Michael said, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "I know who you really are, Dr. Martinez. I know about your engineering background and what happened at your previous company. And I know that Morrison is using this theft investigation to get revenge for what happened in the hallway." David's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing the exhaustion and worry he had been hiding. Behind him, Maria looked up from her homework, sensing the tension in her father's voice. "Dad?" Maria called softly. "Is everything okay?" David glanced back at his daughter, then made a decision that would change the trajectory of both their lives. He stepped aside and gestured for Michael to enter. "Come in," David said quietly. "I think it's time we talked." As Michael entered the small apartment, he felt an unexpected sense of familiarity, as if he belonged in this modest space in a way that his luxury penthouse had never provided. Maria smiled shyly at the visitor, and Michael found himself smiling back with genuine warmth. Neither father nor daughter could have known that they were welcoming someone whose connection to their family ran deeper than professional courtesy or shared principles. They couldn't have known that Michael's presence in their home was the beginning of a truth that would reshape all their lives. The 3 of them sat around the small kitchen table as David told his story in full for the first time since the whistleblowing incident that had destroyed his career. Michael listened with growing respect and determination, understanding that helping David Martinez wasn't just about corporate justice anymore. It was about family, though neither man yet understood the true meaning of that word in their situation. Outside the apartment windows, the Seattle skyline glittered in the evening light, and somewhere in those gleaming towers, Bradley Morrison was celebrating his apparent victory over a janitor who had dared to challenge his authority. But in the small kitchen of apartment 2B, 3 people were forming an alliance that would prove more powerful than corporate politics, more enduring than vindictive revenge, and more transformative than any of them could possibly imagine. The security camera footage from the storage room told a different story than the one Bradley Morrison had carefully constructed. Michael Chun sat in the darkened security office at 11:30 on Sunday night, watching the grainy black and white images flicker across multiple monitors while the night guard dozed in his chair nearby. What Michael saw on those screens would either save David Martinez's career or destroy Michael's own position at Meridian Industries. The timestamp showed Thursday, 2:47 in the morning, nearly 3 hours after David's shift had ended. A figure in a maintenance uniform entered the storage room, moving with purpose toward the shelving unit where the missing equipment had been stored. But the person on the screen wasn't David Martinez. The build was wrong, the gait different, and when the figure turned briefly toward the camera, Michael caught a glimpse of features that belonged to someone else entirely. Marcus Webb, Morrison's loyal associate, appeared clearly on the footage. As he removed the computer equipment and placed it in a large maintenance bag. The theft was deliberate, calculated, and perfectly timed to occur when David would be the obvious suspect. Webb even took care to disturb the dust patterns on nearby shelves, creating evidence that someone had been searching through the storage area. Michael felt a cold fury settle in his chest as he watched the conspiracy unfold on screen. Morrison hadn't just retaliated against David for standing up to workplace bullying. He had orchestrated an elaborate frame job designed to destroy an innocent man's life. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking, even by Morrison's standards, but Michael's discovery created a new problem. Exposing the footage would clear David's name, but it would also reveal that Michael had been conducting his own investigation without authorization. Corporate policy strictly prohibited employees from accessing security systems without proper clearance, and Morrison would undoubtedly use Michael's rule-breaking as ammunition to discredit both the evidence and the messenger. The solution came to Michael as he sat in his car in the empty parking garage, the copied security footage burning like a secret in his briefcase. He couldn't present the evidence himself without facing consequences that would ultimately help no one. But he could ensure that the right person discovered it through proper channels. James Sullivan proved to be the perfect ally for Michael's plan. The accountant had been quietly documenting Morrison's harassment for months, building a file of incidents that painted a clear picture of systematic workplace abuse. When Michael approached him Monday morning with a carefully edited version of the truth, James immediately understood the implications. Michael suggested that James request a comprehensive security review as part of his ongoing documentation of Morrison's retaliation against employees. Such a request would be within James's rights as a harassment victim and would require security to examine all relevant footage from the time period in question. The theft of company property would naturally fall under such a review, and the evidence of Webb's involvement would be discovered through legitimate channels. The plan worked perfectly. By Tuesday afternoon, building security had identified Marcus Webb as the actual thief, and David Martinez had been cleared of all suspicion. But rather than celebrate his vindication, David found himself facing an even more complex situation. The same investigation that had cleared his name had also revealed Michael Chun's unauthorized access to the security system. Patricia Hoffman from Human Resources delivered the news to David personally, her nervous demeanor more pronounced than usual. While David was being officially reinstated with full back pay and an apology from the company, Michael Chun was facing a disciplinary hearing for violating corporate security protocols. The irony was bitter and perfect. The man who had saved David's job was now in danger of losing his own. David's reinstatement came with an unexpected assignment. Rather than returning to his basement duties, he was transferred to the executive floors with a significant pay increase and a new title, Senior Facilities Coordinator. The promotion was clearly intended as compensation for the false accusation and the company's mishandling of the situation. But David suspected that Michael Chun had influenced the decision before his own troubles began. The first person David encountered upon returning to the executive floors was James Sullivan, who greeted him with genuine warmth and relief. James had been instrumental in the investigation that cleared David's name, though he was careful not to reveal Michael's role in the discovery of evidence. The accountant's respect for David had grown considerably during the ordeal, and he made it clear that David had allies among the staff who valued integrity over corporate politics. David's new responsibilities included oversight of maintenance, operations across multiple floors, coordination with various departments for facility improvements, and direct liaison with executive staff regarding building operations. It was work that utilized his engineering background and management experience, though he was careful not to reveal the full extent of his qualifications to avoid uncomfortable questions about his employment history. The promotion also brought David into regular contact with Robert Chun, Michael's adoptive father and the founder of Meridian Industries. The elder Chun was a soft-spoken man in his 60s, with silver hair and keen eyes that seemed to miss nothing. During their first official meeting, Robert studied David with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading character in faces and voices. "Mr. Martinez," Robert said from behind his desk in the corner office that overlooked Elliot. "Bay, I want to personally apologize for what happened to you. The accusation was unfounded, and the company's initial response was inadequate. We pride ourselves on treating all employees with respect and dignity." David appreciated the apology, but he was more interested in discussing Michael's situation. "Mr. Chun, I understand that your son may be facing consequences for his role in clearing my name. That doesn't seem right." Robert's expression grew thoughtful. Michael's actions violated company policy, but his intentions were honorable. He saw an injustice and took steps to correct it, even at personal risk. That kind of character is rare in corporate environments. "It's rare anywhere," David replied quietly. "Your son stood up for me when he didn't have to. He risked his position to help someone he barely knew. That says something important about who he is." The conversation marked the beginning of an unexpected friendship between David and Robert Chun. The older man was impressed by David's lack of bitterness despite his ordeal, and David found himself drawn to Robert's genuine concern for his employees' welfare. They began meeting regularly to discuss facility improvements and operational efficiency, conversations that gradually expanded to include broader topics of ethics, leadership, and the responsibilities that came with corporate power. During one of these meetings, Robert mentioned his concern about Michael's future at the company. While the disciplinary hearing had resulted in only a formal reprimand, the incident had created political enemies who would be watching for any excuse to undermine Michael's position. Morrison and his allies were particularly vindictive, viewing Michael's intervention as a personal attack on their authority. "Michael has always been idealistic," Robert confided to David during a late afternoon meeting. "Sometimes I worry that his sense of justice will put him at odds with the realities of corporate politics. He inherited my principles, but he also inherited my stubbornness." David found himself thinking about those words long after the meeting ended. There was something in Robert's tone, a mixture of pride and concern, that resonated with David's own feelings about his daughter, Maria. The parallels between Robert's relationship with Michael and David's relationship with Maria were striking, though David attributed it to the universal challenges of parenthood rather than anything more specific. Meanwhile, Michael was struggling with the aftermath of his decision to help David. The disciplinary hearing had been humiliating, and the formal reprimand on his record would follow him throughout his career at Meridian. But what bothered him most was the knowledge that his actions had created additional problems for David. who was now navigating a delicate political situation as the newly promoted facilities coordinator. Michael found himself thinking about David Martinez with increasing frequency, drawn by qualities he couldn't quite define. There was something about the man's quiet strength and principled character that reminded Michael of his adoptive father, but there was also something else, a sense of connection that went beyond professional respect or shared values. The feeling intensified when Michael encountered David and Maria at a local coffee shop near the University District. The teenager was working on college applications while her father reviewed building maintenance schedules, and Michael was struck by the easy affection between them. Their relationship seemed effortless in a way that Michael envied, built on genuine understanding and mutual respect rather than the careful gratitude that characterized his relationship with Robert Chun. Maria looked up from her application. Essays with bright eyes and a smile that somehow seemed familiar to Michael, though he couldn't place why. "You're the executive who helped my dad," she said, with the directness of youth. "Thank you for standing up for him." Michael felt an unexpected warmth at her words, a sense of acceptance that was both surprising and oddly comforting. "Your father helped himself by being the kind of person worth defending," he replied, meaning every word. As they talked, Michael learned about Maria's academic achievements and her dreams of studying medicine. Her intelligence was obvious, but it was her compassion that impressed him most. She spoke about wanting to help people who couldn't help themselves, about using her education to make a difference in the world. Her idealism reminded Michael of his own younger self, before corporate realities had tempered his dreams with pragmatic caution. David watched the interaction between Michael and Maria with growing interest. The young executive's genuine concern for his daughter's welfare touched something deep in David's heart, a parental instinct that recognized kindness and authenticity. Michael's questions about Maria's studies weren't polite small talk. They reflected genuine interest in her as a person, not just as the daughter of an employee. When Maria excused herself to visit the restroom, David found himself alone with Michael for the first time since the security investigation had ended. The conversation that followed would plant seeds of suspicion that would eventually grow into earth-shattering revelation. "She's remarkable," Michael said, watching Maria navigate through the crowded coffee shop with easy confidence. "You should be proud of raising such an impressive young woman." David's expression grew complex, a mixture of pride and something that looked almost like regret. "Maria is everything good in my life," he said quietly. "Everything I've done since she was born has been about giving her opportunities I never had." Something in David's tone suggested layers of meaning beneath the simple words. Michael found himself curious about the man's story, about the sacrifices David had made and the choices that had brought him to this point in his life. "She mentioned that her mother isn't in the picture," Michael said carefully, not wanting to intrude but sensing that David needed to talk. David was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the coffee shop windows. "Maria's mother died when she was 3, he said finally. "Cancer. It was just the two of us after that." Michael felt a pang of sympathy for the loss, but something else nagged at him. There had been no mention of a wife in David's employment records, no emergency contact listed except for Maria herself. The timeline seemed somehow incomplete, as if pieces of the story were missing. "I'm sorry for your loss," Michael said sincerely. "Raising a child alone couldn't have been easy, especially while building your engineering career." David's expression grew more guarded, and Michael sensed that he had touched on something sensitive. "Life doesn't always go according to plan," David replied. "Sometimes you have to make choices that seem impossible at the time." Before Michael could ask what he meant, Maria returned to the table with news that would shift the conversation in an entirely different direction. She had been accepted to the University of Washington's pre-med program with a partial scholarship, contingent on maintaining her current academic performance through graduation. The celebration that followed was genuine and joyful, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that David's earlier words contained important information about more than just career setbacks and personal loss. There were mysteries in David Martinez's past that went beyond whistleblowing and corporate retaliation, secrets that might explain the sense of connection Michael felt but couldn't name. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Maria surprised Michael with an impulsive invitation to join them for dinner later that week. David looked startled by his daughter's boldness, but he didn't object to the invitation. Michael accepted with pleasure, looking forward to learning more about these two remarkable people, who had somehow become important to him in ways he didn't fully understand. Walking back to his car, Michael reflected on the strange turns his life had taken since that morning in the hallway when he had witnessed David defending James Sullivan. A simple act of workplace justice had evolved into something more complex and meaningful, a connection that felt both unexpected and somehow inevitable. Neither Michael nor David realized that their growing friendship was built on foundations deeper than shared principles or mutual respect. They couldn't know that the sense of familiarity they felt in each other's presence came from genetics rather than circumstance, from blood rather than coincidence. But as they drove away from the coffee shop in opposite directions, both men carried with them a sense that their lives were moving towards something significant, some revelation or resolution that would explain the inexplicable pull they felt toward each other and the family they were unconsciously rebuilding, one conversation at a time. The dinner invitation Maria had extended turned into a weekly tradition that none of them had planned, but all came to treasure. Every Thursday evening, Michael would arrive at the small apartment in Beacon Hill with takeout from different restaurants around Seattle, and the three of them would sit around the kitchen table sharing stories, debating current events, and gradually building the kind of easy familiarity that usually took years to develop. During these dinners, Michael learned that David possessed not just engineering expertise, but a remarkably broad education that encompassed literature, history, and philosophy. Their conversations ranged from sustainable technology to ancient Greek drama, with Maria contributing insights that impressed both men with their depth and originality. The teenager had inherited her father's intellectual curiosity along with an optimism that seemed unshakable despite the financial struggles that had defined her childhood. Michael found himself looking forward to these evenings with an intensity that surprised him. His penthouse apartment, with its panoramic views and expensive furnishings, felt increasingly empty compared to the warmth of David and Maria's modest home. There was something about being around them that made Michael feel more like himself than he had in years, as if he could set aside the careful politeness that corporate life required and simply exist as who he really was. The feeling was mutual. David had initially been cautious about accepting help from someone so far above his social station, but Michael's genuine interest in their lives and his complete lack of condescension had gradually worn down his defenses. More importantly, David could see how much Maria enjoyed having Michael around. The young executive treated her with the kind of respectful attention that suggested he valued her opinions and appreciated her company, not just tolerated her presence out of politeness. For Maria, Michael represented something she had never experienced, a successful adult who seemed to genuinely care about her future without any ulterior motive. Her father's love was unconditional and sustaining, but Michael offered a different perspective on the world of possibilities that awaited her after graduation. He helped her navigate college application essays, shared insights about academic programs, and connected her with mentors in the medical field who could provide guidance about her career aspirations. It was during one of these Thursday dinners that the first crack appeared in the wall of secrets that had surrounded David's past for over 2 decades. Michael had brought Chinese food from a restaurant in the International District, and their conversation had turned to family traditions and cultural heritage. Maria was describing a research project about immigration patterns in the Pacific Northwest when she casually mentioned something that made both men freeze in their chairs. I wish I knew more about my biological family, she said while opening a container of orange chicken. Dad doesn't really talk about my birth parents, but I think about them sometimes. Like whether I look like my biological mother or if I inherited my math skills from my biological father. Michael's chopsticks paused halfway to his mouth. Birth parents? He asked carefully, glancing at David, whose face had gone pale. Maria looked confused by the reaction her words had caused. Dad adopted me when I was a baby, she said matter-of-factly. Didn't I mention that before? I thought everyone knew. David set down his water glass with trembling hands, clearly struggling with how to respond to his daughter's innocent revelation. Michael felt a strange sensation in his chest, a mixture of recognition and possibility that he couldn't quite name. Maria, David said quietly. We don't usually discuss the adoption with other people. But Maria, in the way of teenagers who see no need for adult secrecy about obvious facts, pressed on. Why not? There's nothing wrong with being adopted. Michael was adopted too, right? She turned to Michael with the expectation of shared understanding. Michael nodded slowly, his mind racing. By Robert Chun when I was infant, he confirmed. I've always known about the adoption. My father was very open about it. See? Maria said to David with the satisfaction of being proved right. It's not a big deal. Besides, you're my real dad anyway. Biology doesn't matter when someone loves you and raises you and teaches you how to be a good person. David's eyes filled with tears at his daughter's words, and Michael felt his own throat tighten with emotion. There was something profoundly moving about Maria's matter-of-fact acceptance of love as the foundation of family, her complete confidence in the bonds that had shaped her life. But underneath the emotional moment, Michael's analytical mind was working through implications and possibilities that seemed both impossible and increasingly plausible. 2 adopted children, both in Seattle, both born around the same time. The sense of recognition he felt when looking at Maria, the inexplicable familiarity of David's presence, the way they all seemed to fit together like pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. Maria, Michael said carefully, do you know anything about the circumstances of your adoption? The agency that handled it, or any details about your biological parents? David immediately became defensive. Michael, I don't think this is an appropriate topic for dinner conversation. But Maria was curious now, her scientific mind engaged by the mystery. Actually, I've been thinking about doing one of those DNA tests for a biology project about genetics. Our school has access to testing kits through the university's research program. Absolutely not, David said firmly, his voice carrying an authority that Maria rarely heard from her generally permissive father. Those tests are invasive and unreliable, and the information they provide isn't worth the privacy risks. Michael watched David's reaction with growing certainty that the man was hiding something significant. The level of panic in David's voice suggested stakes far higher than general privacy concerns or parental protectiveness. Dad, what's wrong? Maria asked, finally picking up on the tension that had filled the room. You're acting really weird about this. David struggled visibly with how much to reveal, how much truth he could safely share without destroying the carefully constructed life he had built for his daughter. Some things are better left in the past, he said finally. The adoption was complicated, and I promised certain people that I would respect their privacy. Michael felt pieces clicking into place in his mind, forming a picture that seemed impossible but increasingly undeniable. David, he said quietly, I think we need to talk privately. The rest of the dinner passed in uncomfortable silence, with Maria clearly sensing that the adults were communicating on a level she wasn't privy to. When the meal ended, David asked Maria to start her homework while he and Michael stepped onto the small balcony that overlooked the apartment complex's courtyard. The Seattle evening was cool and clear, with the lights of the city spreading out below them like a constellation. For several minutes, neither man spoke, both understanding that whatever conversation was about to happen would change everything between them. "How old is Maria?" Michael asked finally. 17, David replied. "She'll be 18 in January." Michael did the math in his head. "So she was born in January 2006. David nodded, not trusting his voice. "I was born in January 2006. Michael said quietly, "January 15th, to be specific." David's sharp intake of breath was answer enough, but Michael pressed on. "At Swedish Medical Center. The adoption was handled by Family Services of King County." "Michael, please stop," David whispered, his hands gripping the balcony railing so tightly his knuckles were white. But Michael couldn't stop, not now that the truth was so close. "You're not Maria's adoptive father, are you? You're her biological father. And if the dates match up, if the location matches up, if everything I'm thinking is true, then you're not just someone who adopted a baby in need. You're someone who gave up 2 babies. David closed his eyes, 23 years of carefully guarded secrets threatening to spill out like water from a broken dam. "You don't understand the circumstances," he said hoarsely. "You don't know what it was like." "Then tell me," Michael said, his voice gentle but insistent. "Tell me about the 23-year-old engineering student who found himself with twin children he couldn't raise. Tell me about the impossible choice between keeping them together and giving them both the lives they deserved." David turned to face Michael then, tears streaming down his cheeks as he looked into eyes that were exactly the same shade of brown as his own. The same eyes he saw in the mirror every morning and in Maria's face every day. "Your mother died in childbirth," David said, the words coming out in a rush after decades of silence. "Complications from carrying twins. She was so young and I was younger. 23 years old, still in graduate school, working 2 jobs to pay for my education. No family support, no money, no way to raise 2 babies on my own." Michael felt the world shifting around him as the truth he had suspected became undeniable reality. "But you kept Maria. I kept one of you," David corrected, his voice breaking. "The social worker said it would be easier to place 1 baby than 2, especially since there was a couple specifically looking for a son. The Chun family had been waiting for years, and they could provide opportunities I never could. College funds, stable home, financial security. So you chose to keep the daughter and give away the son," Michael said, and there was no accusation in his voice, only a need to understand. David shook his head vigorously. "I didn't choose based on gender. I chose based on what each of you needed. You were born with a heart condition that required expensive medical care. The Chuns had insurance, resources, access to the best doctors. Maria was healthy, and I thought I could manage with 1 baby, thought I could figure it out as I went along." The revelation hit Michael like a physical blow. He had known about his childhood heart condition, the surgery that had corrected it when he was 2 years old, but he had never connected it to his adoption story. "The medical care," he said slowly. "That's why you chose to place me with the Chuns. It was the hardest decision of my life," David said, his voice raw with emotion. "But I knew Robert Chun was a good man, knew he would love you and give you everything I couldn't. I thought I was doing the right thing for both of you." Michael stared out at the city lights, processing the magnitude of what he had just learned. Everything he thought he knew about his identity, his family, his place in the world had just been rewritten. The man he had defended in a corporate hallway was his biological father. The teenage girl who had become like a little sister to him was actually his twin. "Does Maria know?" Michael asked. "God, no," David said immediately. "She thinks her twin brother died at birth. It was easier than explaining why I kept her but gave you away. She's always grieved for the brother she never met." The cruelty of that particular lie hit Michael hard. Not only had he and Maria been separated, but she had been led to believe her twin was dead. "She's been mourning me for 17 years, he said quietly. I told myself it was kinder than the truth, David replied. That it was better for her to think her brother was at peace rather than wondering why she wasn't good enough to keep together. They stood in silence for several minutes, both men overwhelmed by the weight of revelation and the complexity of emotions it brought. Michael felt anger and understanding warring in his chest, love and resentment tangled together in ways that would take time to untangle. I need to think about this, Michael said finally. I need time to process what this means. David nodded, understanding that he had forfeited any right to dictate the terms of their relationship moving forward. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I'm sorry for the separation, for the lies, for all the years you didn't know who you really were. Michael turned to go, then paused at the balcony door. Does this change anything between us? The working relationship? The friendship? That's up to you, David replied. I don't expect anything from you, Michael. I gave up the right to expect anything 23 years ago. As Michael left the apartment that night, his mind was reeling with the implications of what he had learned. He drove through the empty Seattle streets in a daze, past the gleaming towers of downtown where his adoptive father had built an empire, past the modest neighborhoods where his biological father had raised his twin sister in quiet dignity. By the time he reached his penthouse, Michael had made a decision that would determine the course of all their lives. He wouldn't tell Maria the truth, not yet. She deserved to learn about her brother's survival in a way that wouldn't shatter her understanding of her father's choices. And David deserved the chance to explain his actions himself when he was ready to face the full consequences of the secrets he had kept. But Michael also knew that the status quo was no longer sustainable. The truth had a way of revealing itself, and keeping secrets required energy that could be better spent building the relationships they had all missed out on for over 2 decades. As he stood on his balcony looking out at the city that contained all the pieces of his fractured family, Michael Chun began planning how to heal wounds that had been bleeding in silence for 23 years, how to bring together a father and his children who had never stopped belonging to each other, even when they didn't know they were related. The conversation with David had answered questions Michael hadn't even known he had, but it had also raised new ones about forgiveness, family, and the possibility of starting over when starting over seemed impossible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for healing or further hurt. But tonight, for the first time in his life, Michael Chun knew exactly who he was and where he came from. The knowledge was painful and complicated, but it was also profoundly liberating. He was no longer just Robert Chun's adopted son or a successful young executive. He was David Martinez's biological child, Maria's twin brother, and part of a family that had never stopped existing, even when it had been torn apart by impossible circumstances and heartbreaking choices. 3 weeks passed in careful suspension, with Michael and David navigating their transformed relationship while maintaining the facade of normalcy for Maria's benefit. Their Thursday dinners continued, but now every shared laugh carried the weight of unspoken truth, every casual conversation threaded with the complexity of their redefined connection. Michael found himself studying Maria's facial expressions, searching for echoes of his own features, while David watched his children interact with a mixture of joy and terror at how quickly his carefully constructed world could unravel. The decision to reveal the truth came not from careful planning, but from an unexpected crisis that forced their hand. Maria collapsed during her calculus exam on a Tuesday morning in November, her body suddenly betraying her with symptoms that sent her directly to the emergency room at Seattle Children's Hospital. David received the call while reviewing blueprints in his office, and the panic in the school nurse's voice transported him instantly back to every parent's worst nightmare. Michael was in a board meeting when David's call came through, but something in the man's trembling voice cut through all corporate priorities. "It's Maria," David said simply, and Michael was already reaching for his jacket before hearing the rest. They met at the hospital, two men bound by love for the same girl but unable to acknowledge their shared terror openly. Maria lay in the emergency department bed looking smaller than her 17 years. Her dark hair spread across the white pillowcase while machines monitored vital signs that fluctuated in ways that made medical professionals speak in hushed, urgent tones. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the attending physician, explained the situation with the careful precision that medical training demanded. Maria's symptoms suggested a genetic cardiac condition that could manifest without warning in late adolescence. The tests they needed to run would require a complete family medical history, genetic information that could help determine the best course of treatment. I'll need to know about any heart conditions in the biological family, Dr. Walsh explained to David, her professional demeanor softening with sympathy. Even if the adoption records are sealed, any information you have could be crucial for her care. David's face went ashen as the implications hit him. The very medical condition that had prompted him to place Michael with a family who could afford proper treatment was now threatening the child he had kept. The irony was devastating and perfect, a cosmic reminder that the past never stayed buried when it mattered most. Michael stepped forward before David could respond. "Doctor, I may be able to help with the family history. I believe Maria and I share biological parents." The words hung in the sterile air of the emergency room like a confession. Dr. Walsh looked confused, glancing between the two men who bore no obvious resemblance to each other, but whose shared concern for the patient was unmistakable. "I don't understand," the doctor said carefully. Michael took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change everything for Maria, but understanding that her health took precedence over family secrets. "Maria and I are twins. We were separated at birth and adopted by different families. I had corrective heart surgery as a child for the same condition she's likely experiencing now." The medical team shifted into a different gear immediately, the revelation providing crucial information for treatment planning. But Maria, despite her medication-induced haze, had heard enough to understand that her world had just shifted on its axis. "Twins?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the beeping of monitors. "But Dad said you died." "He said my brother died when we were born." David moved to her bedside with tears streaming down his face. 23 years of protective lies crumbling in the face of his daughter's medical crisis. "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting you by keeping the truth simple." Maria's eyes moved between her father and Michael, her brilliant mind working through the implications even as cardiac medications clouded her thinking. "Michael is my brother. My twin brother, and you never told me he was alive." The accusation in her voice was devastating, but Michael knew that family reconciliation would have to wait. "Maria, we can talk about all of this after we make sure you're okay. Right now, the doctors need information to help you, and I can provide that." Over the next several hours, Michael shared his complete medical history with the cardiology team while David sat vigil beside Maria's bed. The genetic information proved invaluable, allowing doctors to quickly identify the specific condition and develop a treatment plan that would prevent the life-threatening complications that could have developed without proper intervention. By evening, Maria was stable and scheduled for a minor surgical procedure that would correct the heart rhythm irregularity. The prognosis was excellent, but the emotional damage from the day's revelations would take much longer to heal. Robert Chun arrived at the hospital after learning about the crisis from Michael's assistant. The elder Chun's confusion about why his son was so invested in an employee's family situation quickly gave way to understanding when Michael explained the truth about his biological connection to David and Maria. 23 years, Robert said quietly, sitting in the hospital waiting room while Maria underwent her procedure. 23 years you've been part of our family, and your biological father has been working in our building. David, exhausted from the emotional upheaval of the day, looked at the man who had raised his son with profound gratitude. "You gave him everything I couldn't," he said simply. You made him into the kind of person who would risk his career to defend a stranger. That says everything about who you are as a father. Robert studied David with the same careful attention he had always paid to character assessment. And you raised a remarkable daughter under circumstances I can't imagine. That says everything about who you are. The surgery was successful, and Maria woke up in recovery with a heart rhythm that was steady and strong. But the emotional healing would prove more complicated than the medical intervention. Maria's anger at her father's deception was profound and justified. Her sense of betrayal compounded by grief for all the years she had mourned a brother who was alive and living in the same city. How could you let me think he was dead? She asked David during one of their first conversations after the surgery. How could you let me cry for him every year on our birthday, thinking I was alone in the world? David had no adequate answer. For the pain he had caused, no explanation that could justify the magnitude of his deception. I thought I was protecting you from feeling abandoned, he said weakly. I thought it was easier than explaining why I kept you, but gave him away. Easier for who? Maria demanded, her anger giving her strength despite her recent surgery. Easier for you to avoid explaining your choices, or easier for me to understand my place in the world? Michael found himself in the unexpected position of mediating between his father and sister, helping them navigate emotions too complex for easy resolution. His own feelings about the separation were complicated, mixing gratitude for his privileged upbringing with grief for the family connections he had missed. I don't blame you for the choice you made, Michael told David during one of their private conversations. I understand why you thought placement with the Chuns was best for my medical needs. But I do wish you had found a way to let us know about each other as we grew up. The healing process was gradual and imperfect, marked by difficult conversations and painful honesty. Maria struggled with feeling deceived by the person she trusted most in the world. David grappled with guilt over decisions that had seemed right at the time, but had caused decades of unnecessary pain. Michael worked to build relationships with biological family members, while honoring his connection to the adoptive father who had shaped his life. Robert Chun, with the wisdom that came from years of successful leadership, helped facilitate the family's reconciliation by providing practical support without imposing his own agenda. He arranged for Maria's medical expenses to be covered completely, established a college fund that would ensure her dreams of medical school could become reality, and quietly restructured David's position at Meridian to better utilize his engineering expertise. The breakthrough in their healing came during Maria's 18th birthday celebration in January. For the first time since the hospital revelation, the four of them gathered together in Robert's home, a recognition that their family had grown rather than simply been redefined. Maria had requested a small celebration, still processing the magnitude of changes in her life. But as she looked around the table at her father, her newfound brother, and the man who had become a second father figure, she realized that her family hadn't been broken by the truth. It had been completed. I want to understand the choice you made, she said to David as they shared birthday cake. Not because I'm ready to forgive yet, but because I want to know the whole story of how we got here. David told the complete truth for the first time, sharing details about their mother's death, his financial struggles, and the impossible mathematics of single parenthood with twin infants. He spoke about the agony of choosing which child to place for adoption, about the years of wondering whether Michael was happy and healthy, about the constant fear that Maria would somehow discover his deception. Michael shared his own perspective, describing his childhood with the Chuns, his gratitude for opportunities that had shaped his life, and his complex feelings about learning the truth about his origins. He spoke about the sense of recognition he had felt from their first meeting, the inexplicable pull toward both David and Maria that had made sense only in retrospect. As the evening progressed, something shifted in the room. The anger and pain remained, but they were joined by understanding, forgiveness, and the recognition that love had motivated all their choices, even the ones that had caused harm. "I can't change the past," David said as the celebration wound down. "I can't give you back the years you spent thinking your brother was dead, or give Michael back the chance to grow up knowing his twin. But I can promise that there will be no more secrets, no more protection through deception." Maria nodded slowly, her birthday marking not just another year of life but the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. "We're family," she said simply. Complicated, messy, imperfect family, but family. 6 months later, Michael stood in the same hallway where he had first witnessed David defending James Sullivan from Bradley Morrison's bullying, but now the dynamic was completely different. David had been promoted to Chief of Engineering Operations, his expertise finally recognized and properly utilized. Morrison had been transferred to a different division after multiple harassment complaints, his influence effectively neutralized. Most importantly, the relationship between the men had evolved from professional courtesy to genuine family connection. They worked together not just as colleagues, but as father and son, building bridges across decades of separation through shared projects and daily interactions. Maria thrived in her freshman year at the University of Washington, her medical studies, supported by both her father's love and her brother's mentorship. The heart condition that had initially threatened her health had become manageable with proper treatment, and her dreams of becoming a doctor remained firmly on track. The story that began with a chance encounter in a corporate hallway had transformed into something none of them could have imagined. A family separated by impossible circumstances had found its way back together, not through dramatic revelation, but through the patient work of rebuilding trust and understanding. As Michael walked through the building where his biological father worked and his adoptive father's legacy lived on, he reflected on the complex nature of identity and belonging. He was Robert Chun's son and David Martinez's son, Maria's brother and an only child, a corporate executive and part of a working-class family. All of these identities were true simultaneously, enriching rather than contradicting each other. The biggest surprise was how natural it felt to have both families, how seamlessly his life had expanded to include relationships he hadn't known he was missing. Love, it turned out, was not a finite resource but an infinite one, growing stronger, rather than weaker when shared among more people. On a clear Seattle evening, as the sun set over Elliott Bay and painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, Michael Chen Martinez looked out at the city that contained his entire world and felt, for the first time in his life, completely whole. 2 years after the revelation that had reshaped their understanding of family, the Martinez-Chen household had evolved into something none of them could have anticipated. What had begun as separate lives intersecting through corporate coincidence had grown into a complex but deeply satisfying extended family structure that challenged traditional definitions of home and belonging. Maria, now a sophomore at the University of Washington with a perfect academic record in pre-med studies, had inherited more than just her father's intelligence and her brother's determination. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to navigate the emotional complexities that came with having two fathers, each offering different perspectives on life, success, and responsibility. Her apartment near campus had become a neutral meeting ground where David and Robert could discuss their shared investment in her future without the complications of their professional relationship at Meridian Industries. The transformation in David's career had been nothing short of remarkable. His promotion to Chief of Engineering Operations had unlocked potential that had been suppressed for years, allowing him to implement innovative water management systems that had garnered international attention. The whistleblowing incident that had once destroyed his professional reputation had been recontextualized as evidence of ethical leadership, and industry publications now featured his work prominently. More importantly, David had found peace with his past choices, understanding finally that survival sometimes required compromises that could only be judged fairly in hindsight. Michael's role within the family structure was perhaps the most complex of all. He remained Robert Chun's heir apparent at Meridian Industries, but his identity had expanded to include the working-class values and social consciousness that David had modeled throughout his own difficult journey. This dual perspective made Michael a more effective leader, someone who understood both the executive suite and the maintenance closet, both inherited privilege and earned respect. The weekly family dinners had evolved into elaborate affairs held alternately at Robert's Bellevue Estate and David's upgraded apartment in Capitol Hill. The meals themselves were less important than the conversations they facilitated. Discussions that ranged from Maria's latest research project to David's engineering innovations to Michael's strategic plans for expanding Meridian's environmental initiatives. It was during one of these dinners, on a particularly rainy Seattle evening in March, that Maria announced news that would once again reshape their family dynamic in unexpected ways. "I've been accepted to the medical school exchange program with Doctors Without Borders," she said quietly, setting down her fork and looking around the table at the three men, who had each contributed to her development in essential ways. "It's a 2-year commitment in West Africa, working on waterborne disease prevention in refugee camps." The silence that followed her announcement was heavy with multiple layers of emotion. Pride, concern, fear, and admiration all competed for expression as each man processed the implications of Maria's decision. Robert was the first to speak, his business instincts immediately grasping the significance of the opportunity. "That's an incredible honor, Maria. The selection process for that program is extraordinarily competitive." David's response was more complex, his parental protectiveness warring with his understanding of his daughter's need to make her own choices about service and sacrifice. "It's dangerous work," he said carefully. "The regions where Doctors Without Borders operates are often politically unstable, medically challenging, and far from any support systems you're familiar with." Michael found himself caught between his roles as protective brother and supportive family member. "What drew you to this particular program?" he asked, genuinely curious about the thought process that had led to such a significant decision. Maria's explanation revealed the depth of her commitment to using her education for humanitarian purposes, a dedication that clearly reflected the values all three men had contributed to her development. She spoke about wanting to work in communities where medical expertise could make the difference between life and death, about using her privileged access to education to serve people who had been denied such opportunities. "I've been thinking about this since my freshman year," she continued. "The heart condition that brought us all together also taught me how quickly medical situations can become critical. I want to be the kind of doctor who can handle those emergencies in places where resources are limited and expertise is desperately needed." David's eyes filled with tears as he recognized his own idealistic younger self in his daughter's words. The engineer who had once designed water purification systems for disaster relief could hardly object to his daughter's desire to serve similar populations through medical intervention. "When would you leave?" Robert asked, already mentally calculating the logistics of supporting Maria's decision while ensuring her safety and success. "September," Maria replied. "That gives me 6 months to complete additional training in tropical medicine and emergency procedures. The program also requires me to become fluent in French, since I'll be working primarily in Francophone regions." Michael immediately began thinking about ways Meridian Industries could support Maria's work, perhaps through partnerships with international development organizations or by providing technological resources for the communities she would serve. Would there be opportunities for collaboration with engineering projects? He asked. Water treatment, sanitation systems, renewable energy for medical facilities? The question sparked a longer conversation about the intersection of engineering and medical work in developing regions, a discussion that revealed how naturally their family had come to think in terms of collaborative problem-solving and mutual support. Over the following weeks, the family rallied around Maria's decision with characteristic thoroughness. Robert used his business connections to arrange meetings with Doctors Without Borders leadership, ensuring that Maria would have access to the best possible preparation and support systems. David drew on his own experience with international development work to help Maria understand the cultural and logistical challenges she would face. Michael began developing a proposal for Meridian Industries to sponsor educational technology for the medical facilities where Maria would work. The preparations also provided an opportunity for deeper conversations about family, legacy, and the responsibilities that came with privilege and education. Maria's decision to spend 2 years serving in refugee camps forced all of them to examine their own choices about how to use their advantages to benefit others. "I think about the choice you made when Michael and I were born," Maria told David during one of their private conversations. "You sacrificed your own comfort to make sure we both had opportunities. This feels like my way of paying that forward, using the education you made possible to help people who don't have those same chances." David was moved by his daughter's perspective on his long-ago decision, understanding finally that Maria's commitment to service was not just personal idealism but a direct result of the values he had tried to instill despite their difficult circumstances. The 6 months of preparation passed quickly, filled with medical training, language study, and family time that felt both precious and finite. Michael found himself traveling more frequently between his penthouse and the family gatherings, wanting to maximize his time with Maria before her departure. During one of these visits, David made an unexpected suggestion that would further complicate their already complex family structure. "I've been thinking about taking a leave of absence from Meridian," he said during a Sunday brunch at Robert's house. "The water treatment work I've been doing here could be adapted for refugee camp situations. Maria won't be the only one in the family working on international development." The proposal was vintage David Martinez, the same impulse toward service that had led him to blow the whistle on environmental safety violations years earlier. But it also represented a significant financial sacrifice, giving up his newly elevated position for uncertain work in challenging conditions. Robert's response surprised everyone. "What if you didn't have to choose between financial security and meaningful work?" he asked thoughtfully. "Meridian has been looking for opportunities to expand our international development portfolio. A partnership with Doctors Without Borders could be exactly the kind of initiative we need to demonstrate our commitment to environmental justice." The conversation that followed laid the groundwork for an unprecedented corporate partnership that would send both Maria and David to West Africa as part of an integrated medical and engineering team. Meridian Industries would fund the engineering infrastructure, while Doctors Without Borders provided medical expertise, creating a model for collaboration that could be replicated in other regions. Michael's role in the partnership would be to oversee the project from Seattle, maintaining communication with the field team, and ensuring that corporate resources were deployed effectively. It was an arrangement that would keep the family connected across continents, while allowing each member to contribute their expertise to meaningful work. The night before Maria and David's departure, the extended family gathered for a farewell dinner that carried emotional weight disproportionate to its simple format. Robert had arranged for the meal to be held at the restaurant where Michael had first encountered David defending James Sullivan, a location that had become symbolically important to their family story. As they sat around the table where so many important conversations had taken place, each member of the family reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years earlier, they had been strangers connected only by biological relationships they didn't understand. Now they were a functioning family unit capable of supporting each other's most ambitious dreams. "I want to say something before you leave," Michael began, looking around the table at the people who had redefined his understanding of identity and belonging. "When I first defended Dad in that hallway, I had no idea I was protecting my biological father. I just knew that an injustice was being committed against someone who didn't deserve it. But I think that instinct to protect each other is what makes us family, not the genetics or the adoption papers, or any of the complicated history we've had to work through." Maria reached across the table to take her brother's hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I spent 17 years thinking my twin brother was dead, mourning someone I thought I'd lost forever. Learning that you were alive was like getting a piece of my soul back. But watching you choose to be my brother, even after learning about all the complicated circumstances, that's what made us really family." David struggled to find words adequate to express his gratitude for the forgiveness and acceptance his children had shown him. "I made choices 23 years ago that seemed impossible at the time," he said quietly. "I thought I was sacrificing our family to give you both better lives. I never imagined that family could be rebuilt stronger than it was originally, that love could be more powerful than separation." Robert's contribution to the farewell was characteristically practical but deeply moving. "Family isn't just about who raised you or who shares your genetics," he said, looking at each of them in turn. "It's about who chooses to stand with you when life gets complicated, who celebrates your successes and supports you through failures. This family has survived separation, deception, medical crises, and corporate politics. I have no doubt it will survive 2 years of international service work." The departure at SeaTac Airport the next morning was emotional but hopeful. Maria and David were embarking on work that would challenge them professionally and personally. But they were doing so with the support of a family structure that had proven remarkably resilient. Michael and Robert stood together at the departure gate, watching father and daughter disappear into the boarding tunnel that would carry them halfway around the world. The sight of David and Maria walking side by side toward their shared mission provided a powerful reminder of how completely their family story had been transformed. "Are you worried about them?" Robert asked as they drove back toward downtown Seattle. Michael considered the question carefully. "I'm concerned about their safety and the challenges they'll face," he replied. "But I'm not worried about their ability to handle whatever comes. They've both survived worse circumstances with less support. Now they have each other, and they have us backing them up from here." The first letters from West Africa arrived 3 weeks later, filled with detailed descriptions of the medical camp where Maria was working and the water treatment facility that David was designing. The challenges were enormous, as expected. But both father and daughter were thriving in the environment of meaningful work and direct impact on human welfare. Maria's letters revealed a young doctor discovering her own capabilities under pressure, treating conditions she had only read about in textbooks while working with limited resources and maximum urgency. Her descriptions of successful treatments and lives saved provided powerful validation for her decision to pursue international medical service. David's reports focused on the engineering challenges of providing clean water and sanitation to temporary communities of displaced people. The technical problems were complex, but David's years of experience with innovative water treatment had prepared him well for the creative problem-solving required. More importantly, his work was directly supporting the medical mission by preventing the waterborne diseases that Maria and her colleagues were treating. The partnership between Meridian Industries and Doctors Without Borders proved more successful than anyone had anticipated. The integrated approach to medical and engineering support created efficiencies that benefited both organizations while providing better outcomes for the communities they served. Robert found himself fielding calls from other corporations interested in replicating the model in different regions. Michael's role as project coordinator gave him intimate knowledge of international development work that complemented his corporate leadership experience. He began incorporating lessons learned from the Africa project into Meridian's domestic operations, emphasizing community engagement and environmental justice in ways that honored both his adoptive father's business acumen and his biological father's ethical commitments. 6 months into the Africa deployment, Michael received a call that would test the family's resilience once again. Maria had contracted malaria despite taking preventive medication, and while her condition was stable, she required medical evacuation to a better-equipped facility in Morocco for treatment. The crisis brought out the best in their family's crisis management capabilities. Robert immediately arranged for private medical transport and the best available treatment, while Michael coordinated with both Doctors Without Borders and Meridian's international insurance carriers. David, despite his own desire to accompany Maria, remained at the camp to continue essential water treatment work while staying in constant communication about his daughter's condition. Maria's recovery was complete and relatively rapid, but the incident reminded all of them about the genuine risks associated with international service work. When she was cleared to return to the field, Maria made a decision that reflected her growing maturity and her family's influence on her thinking. Instead of returning to the same camp, she requested assignment to the Morocco facility where she had been treated, recognizing that her experience as a patient had given her valuable insights into medical care delivery in resource-limited settings. The decision demonstrated the kind of adaptive thinking that both Robert and David had modeled throughout their careers. David's response to the malaria crisis was characteristically pragmatic. He accelerated his work on improved mosquito control systems for the camp, understanding that engineering solutions could prevent future medical emergencies. The project became a model for integrated pest control that was later adopted by development organizations working in similar environments. As the 2-year commitment neared its end, the family began planning for Maria and David's return to Seattle. But the discussions revealed that their time in Africa had changed them in ways that would permanently affect their future choices. Maria had decided to specialize in tropical medicine and international health, with plans to split her time between clinical practice in Seattle and ongoing deployment with humanitarian organizations. The experience of treating patients in resource-limited settings had convinced her that this was her calling, her way of honoring both her privilege and her sense of responsibility to global health equity. David's perspective on his career had also evolved during the African deployment. The direct impact of his engineering work on human welfare had rekindled the idealism that had been suppressed during his years of employment difficulties. He approached Robert and Michael with a proposal to establish a permanent international development division within Meridian Industries, focusing on water treatment and sanitation projects in underserved communities worldwide. The proposal represented a significant expansion of Meridian's mission, but Robert recognized that David's vision aligned perfectly with the company's founding values of using technology to solve environmental problems. More importantly, the international development work would provide ongoing opportunities for family members to collaborate on meaningful projects while building on the successful partnership model they had developed. Michael's reaction to his father's proposal was enthusiastically supportive, but it also prompted him to make his own announcement about the future direction of his career. The experience of coordinating the Africa project had convinced him that Meridian Industries should become a leader in corporate social responsibility, using business success to fund humanitarian initiatives rather than treating such work as peripheral charity. "I want to restructure my role at Meridian," Michael told Robert during one of their weekly business meetings. "Instead of focusing solely on domestic operations, I want to develop sustainable business models that generate profit while addressing global environmental and health challenges." The Africa project proved that corporations can do well by doing good, but only if we're willing to integrate social responsibility into our core business strategy. Robert's response reflected both his pride in Michael's leadership development and his understanding that the next generation would need to address challenges that traditional business models couldn't solve. "The company needs that kind of vision," he agreed. "Meridian's future depends on proving that environmental technology can be both profitable and socially beneficial. If you can build sustainable revenue streams around international development work, you'll position us to lead an entire industry transformation." The return of Maria and David from Africa was celebrated with a family reunion that felt like a culmination of their 2-year journey toward redefining success and purpose. The airport arrival was emotional but different from their departure, marked by confidence and experience rather than uncertainty and hope. Maria looked like someone who had discovered her true calling, carrying herself with the assurance that came from successful navigation of genuine challenges. Her stories from the field revealed a young doctor who had learned to innovate under pressure while maintaining the compassion that had originally drawn her to medicine. David's transformation was equally evident, but more subtle. The defensive wariness that had characterized his demeanor during his early days at Meridian had been replaced by quiet confidence in his ability to contribute meaningfully to important work. The 2 years of seeing his engineering solutions directly improve human welfare had restored his sense of professional purpose. The dinner that welcomed them home was held at Robert's house, but the conversation focused on future plans rather than past accomplishments. Maria outlined her residency applications in tropical medicine while describing ongoing commitments to return to Africa for regular deployments. David presented his detailed proposal for Meridian's International Development Division, complete with financial projections and partnership strategies. Michael's contribution to the evening was an announcement that surprised everyone, including himself. "I've been thinking about our family story," he said as dessert was being served. "About the choices Dad made 23 years ago. About the way we found each other. About the work we've been able to do together. I think there's something important about documenting that story, not just for ourselves, but for other families dealing with separation and reconciliation." The proposal that emerged from that conversation would eventually become a book documenting the intersection of personal family drama with broader social issues of adoption, corporate responsibility, and international service. But more immediately, it represented Michael's recognition that their family's experience contained lessons that could benefit others facing similar challenges. As the evening wound down and family members prepared to return to their respective homes, the sense of completion was palpable. They had survived separation, deception, medical crises, international deployment, and corporate restructuring. More importantly, they had emerged from these challenges with stronger relationships and clearer understanding of their individual and collective purposes. The Martinez Chen family had become something unprecedented in their experience, a functional extended family unit that combined biological connections, adoptive relationships, and chosen family bonds into a structure that was both stable and flexible enough to support each member's most ambitious dreams. Standing on Robert's deck overlooking Lake Washington as the Seattle skyline glittered in the distance, Michael reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The chance encounter in a corporate hallway had set in motion a series of events that had transformed 4 separate individuals into a family capable of supporting international humanitarian work while building successful business enterprises. The future held challenges that none of them could fully anticipate, but they faced those challenges with the confidence that came from having already survived the impossible. They had proven that family could be rebuilt stronger than it was originally, that love could overcome decades of separation, and that privilege carried responsibilities that could be transformed into meaningful service. As they said their goodbyes and headed home through the quiet Seattle streets, each member of the family carried with them the knowledge that they had created something rare and valuable, a family structure that honored both individual ambition and collective responsibility, that celebrated both inherited advantages and earned achievements, and that would continue to evolve as they faced whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. 5 years had passed since that transformative evening when the truth about Michael and Maria's relationship had first emerged, and the Martinez Chen family had evolved into something that defied conventional categories. What had begun as a story of workplace justice had become a testament to the power of chosen family, second chances, and the unexpected ways that love could transcend time and circumstance. The book documenting their journey, co-authored by Michael and Maria with extensive input from David and Robert, had become an unexpected bestseller in the adoption and family reconciliation communities. Titled Found: A Family's Journey Through Separation and Healing, the memoir had sparked conversations about adoption ethics, corporate responsibility, and the complex emotions surrounding family reunion after decades of separation. More importantly for the family themselves, the process of writing their story together had provided opportunities for deeper healing and understanding. The careful examination of their shared history had allowed them to process emotions and experiences that had been too overwhelming to address in real time, creating space for forgiveness and growth that continued to strengthen their bonds. Maria had completed her residency in tropical medicine and was now Dr. Maria Martinez, splitting her time between a clinic in Seattle's International District and regular deployments with various humanitarian organizations. Her expertise in waterborne disease prevention had made her a sought-after consultant for development projects worldwide, and she had established herself as a leading voice in the intersection of environmental health and medical intervention. The clinic where Maria worked served primarily immigrant and refugee communities, populations that reminded her daily of the global health inequities she had witnessed during her time in Africa. Her approach to medicine had been profoundly shaped by her family's complex history, emphasizing the importance of understanding patients' full stories rather than simply treating their immediate symptoms. David's transformation into one of the leading figures in humanitarian engineering had been even more dramatic than his children's career successes. Meridian Industries' International Development Division, which he now directed, had become a model for corporate social responsibility that was studied in business schools across the country. The division's innovative approaches to water treatment, renewable energy, and sustainable infrastructure had won numerous awards while generating sufficient revenue to be completely self-sustaining. What set David's work apart was his insistence on involving local communities in every aspect of project design and implementation. His own experience of having important decisions made about his life by others had sensitized him to the importance of empowering people to shape their own solutions to environmental and health challenges. Michael's role had evolved as well, though his transformation had been more subtle and strategic. As Chief Operating Officer of Meridian Industries, he had successfully integrated social responsibility into the company's core business model, proving that environmental technology could be both profitable and socially beneficial. His leadership style reflected lessons learned from both his adoptive father's business acumen and his biological father's commitment to ethical decision-making. The success of Meridian's humanitarian initiatives had attracted attention from other corporations seeking to develop similar programs, and Michael found himself frequently speaking at conferences about the business case for social responsibility. His presentations always included personal elements from his family story, demonstrating how individual ethical choices could scale up to create systematic change. Robert, now in his 70s, had stepped back from day-to-day operations at Meridian while remaining actively involved as chairman of the board. His decision to transition leadership to Michael had been motivated partly by health concerns, but primarily by his recognition that the company's future required someone who understood both traditional business principles and emerging social consciousness. The elder Chun's relationship with David had deepened over the years into genuine friendship, based on shared values and mutual respect. Their weekly breakfast meetings had become legendary among Meridian employees, sessions where two very different men would hash out complex problems, involving everything from engineering specifications to family dynamics to corporate ethics. On a crisp October morning, the family gathered at Robert's house for what had become an annual tradition, a celebration of the anniversary of Michael and David's first meeting in the Meridian hallway. The date had taken on symbolic importance. As a reminder of how chance encounters could reshape entire lives, when people chose to act with courage and integrity. This year's celebration carried special significance because it marked the launch of the Martinez Foundation, a philanthropic organization that would formalize the family's commitment to supporting adoption services, humanitarian engineering projects, and medical programs serving underserved communities worldwide. The foundation had been Maria's idea, born from her recognition that their family's resources and expertise could be leveraged to help other families navigate similar challenges. The foundation's mission statement emphasized the importance of keeping families together when possible while providing support for children who needed placement in loving homes regardless of their biological origins. I keep thinking about all the families who don't have the advantages we've had, Maria said as they gathered around Robert's dining room table for their celebration brunch. Dad made an impossible choice 23 years ago because he didn't have access to the kind of support systems that could have helped him raise twins as a single father. How many other parents are facing similar impossible choices right now? The question had motivated the foundation's focus on practical support for struggling families, emergency childcare, medical assistance, educational scholarships, and job training programs designed to help parents develop skills that would allow them to provide stable homes for their children. David's contribution to the foundation drew on his engineering expertise and his understanding of how environmental factors affected family stability. The foundation's community development projects would focus on providing clean water, renewable energy, and sustainable infrastructure to communities where environmental challenges threaten family cohesion. Poverty isn't just about money, David explained to the foundation's inaugural board meeting. It's about having access to basic services that allow families to focus on raising children instead of simply surviving from day to day. Clean water, reliable electricity, safe housing. These aren't luxuries, they're prerequisites for stable family life. Michael's approach to the foundation reflected his business background and his understanding of sustainable philanthropy. Rather than simply providing charity, the foundation would invest in community-led initiatives that could become self-sustaining over time, creating long-term improvements in family stability rather than temporary relief. We want to model the kind of philanthropy that builds capacity rather than creating dependency, Michael told the local media during the foundation's launch event. Our family story demonstrates that with the right support at critical moments, people can overcome incredible challenges and go on to contribute meaningfully to their communities. Robert's role in the foundation was primarily advisory, but his business connections and philanthropic experience proved invaluable in establishing partnerships with established organizations and securing initial funding. His network of corporate leaders provided access to resources and expertise that amplified the foundation's impact far beyond what their family could accomplish independently. The foundation's first major project was a pilot program in 3 Seattle neighborhoods with high concentrations of immigrant families. The program provided integrated services including job training for parents, after-school programming for children, and community development projects that addressed environmental health issues affecting family welfare. Maria served as the program's medical director, overseeing health screenings and preventive care that addressed both immediate medical needs and underlying environmental factors that contributed to health disparities. Her work with refugee communities had taught her that effective medical intervention required understanding the social and environmental context that shaped health outcomes. David's engineering team worked with community members to identify and address infrastructure problems that affected family stability, lead pipes that contaminated drinking water, inadequate heating systems that forced families to choose between rent money and utility bills, and drainage problems that created unsanitary conditions around apartment buildings. Michael coordinated the business development aspects of the program, helping participants access job training, small business loans, and entrepreneurship support that could provide pathways to economic stability. His approach emphasized building on existing community strengths rather than imposing external solutions. The pilot program's success exceeded everyone's expectations, demonstrating that relatively modest investments in comprehensive family support could produce dramatic improvements in child welfare, educational outcomes, and community stability. The results attracted attention from federal agencies and other foundations interested in replicating the model in different regions. More personally significant for the family was the way the foundation work had deepened their understanding of their own story and its broader implications. Working with other families facing separation, reunification, and economic challenges had provided context that helped them appreciate both the universality of their struggles and the particular advantages that had enabled their successful reunion. Every family we work with reminds me of some aspect of our own journey, Maria reflected during one of their foundation planning meetings. The single parents struggling to provide opportunities for their children, the adoptive families trying to honor their children's biological heritage, the young people trying to understand their identity when their family structure doesn't match conventional expectations. The foundation work also provided ongoing opportunities for healing and growth within their own family relationships. Working together on projects that reflected their shared values created space for continued conversation about their individual and collective experiences, while building toward a legacy that honored both their struggles and their advantages. As the foundation approached its first anniversary, the family began planning for expanded programming that would include international components. Maria's connections with humanitarian organizations provided access to communities worldwide where family support services could make dramatic differences in child welfare outcomes. David's international development experience offered insights into how community-based engineering projects could strengthen family stability in regions affected by environmental challenges, conflict, or economic disruption. His approach emphasized training local technicians who could maintain and expand infrastructure projects long after external support ended. Michael's business network included corporate leaders interested in supporting international development work as part of their own social responsibility initiatives. His role involved developing sustainable funding models that could support long-term programming without creating dependency on charitable donations. Robert's advisory role had evolved to include mentoring other business leaders who wanted to establish similar family foundations. His experience with both traditional philanthropy and the more innovative approaches pioneered by the Martinez Foundation made him a valuable resource for others seeking to leverage business success for social benefit. On the evening of the Foundation's first anniversary celebration, the family gathered once again at Robert's house, this time joined by community members, Foundation staff, and program participants who had become part of their extended family network. The celebration felt like a culmination of years of intentional relationship building and purposeful work. As Michael stood before the assembled group to deliver remarks about the Foundation's first year, he reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. The chance encounter in a corporate hallway had set in motion a series of events that had not only reunited his biological family, but had also created opportunities to support hundreds of other families facing similar challenges. Our foundation exists because ordinary people make extraordinary choices at critical moments, Michael told the gathering. My biological father chose to defend a colleague from workplace bullying, even though it put his job at risk. My adoptive father chose to support an employee's family, even when corporate politics suggested he should distance himself. My sister chose to forgive deception and embrace a brother she had thought was dead. These individual acts of courage and compassion created ripple effects that continue to expand, touching lives far beyond our immediate family. The celebration that followed was both joyful and deeply moving, a recognition of how far they had all traveled from those early days of tentative connection and careful healing. The room was filled with people whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work, but also by people who had become part of the Martinez family's chosen community. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, the core family members remained behind to clean up and reflect on the milestone they were celebrating. The comfortable rhythm of their shared domestic tasks reflected years of building trust and intimacy across relationships that had once seemed impossible to navigate. Maria was the first to articulate what they were all feeling. "I never imagined that learning the truth about my brother's survival would lead to all of this," she said, gesturing around the room that still held traces of the evening's celebration. "But I think that's what family does. It creates possibilities none of us could envision on our own." David's response came from a place of deep gratitude for the forgiveness and acceptance his children had shown him over the years. "I spent 23 years believing that the choice I made had permanently damaged our family. Learning that families can be rebuilt stronger than they were originally has been the greatest gift of my life." Michael felt the weight of his dual role as both beneficiary and steward of the opportunities that had shaped his life. This foundation represents our commitment to ensuring that other families have access to the same kind of second chances we've been given. But more than that, it represents our understanding that individual healing and social responsibility are inseparably connected. Robert's contribution to the reflection drew on his years of business experience and his understanding of legacy building. The success of this foundation demonstrates that the most sustainable philanthropic work grows out of personal experience and authentic commitment to social justice. Your family story has given you unique insights into the challenges facing other families, and your willingness to share those insights has created opportunities for healing that extend far beyond your immediate circle. As they finished cleaning up and prepared to go to their respective homes, the sense of completion was balanced by anticipation for the work that lay ahead. The foundation had established a solid foundation for expanded programming, and each family member had identified ways to deepen their individual contributions to their shared mission. The Martinez family had created something unprecedented in their experience, a functional extended family unit that had successfully integrated personal healing with social responsibility, individual success with collective purpose, and intimate family relationships with broader community engagement. Walking out into the clear Seattle night, with the city lights reflecting off the calm waters of Lake Washington, Michael felt the deep satisfaction that came from understanding his place in both his immediate family and the broader community they were working to serve. The chance encounter that had begun their journey toward reunion had evolved into a lifelong commitment to creating the kind of world where all families could thrive regardless of their circumstances or challenges. Their story continued to unfold, but the foundation they had built, both literally and metaphorically, would ensure that their impact extended far beyond their individual lives, creating opportunities for healing and growth that would benefit families for generations to come. 10 years after that fateful morning when Michael Chun first witnessed a janitor defending a colleague from workplace bullying, the ripple effects of that single act of courage had transformed not just one family, but an entire approach to corporate responsibility and social healing. The Martinez Foundation had grown into a nationally recognized organization, operating programs in 12 states and 3 countries. What had begun as a family's attempt to give back had evolved into a movement that challenged conventional thinking about adoption services, family support, and the intersection of business success with social justice. Maria, now 32 and recognized as one of the country's leading experts in global health equity, had recently returned from a 2-year assignment establishing medical training programs in Southeast Asia. Her work had expanded beyond direct patient care to focus on building sustainable healthcare systems that could serve vulnerable populations long after international aid organizations departed. David had been invited to speak at the United Nations about innovative approaches to water security in refugee populations. His engineering solutions were being implemented in displaced person camps across 4 continents, and his insistence on community-led development had become the gold standard for humanitarian infrastructure projects. Michael's leadership at Meridian Industries had proven that corporations could achieve exceptional financial success while maintaining unwavering commitment to social responsibility. The company's integrated business model had been studied and replicated by organizations worldwide, demonstrating that ethical leadership and profitable enterprise were not just compatible but mutually reinforcing. Robert, now 78, had established an endowment at the University of Washington that funded scholarships specifically for students aging out of foster care. His quiet philanthropy had touched hundreds of lives while honoring the lessons he had learned from watching his adopted son reconnect with his biological family. The annual gathering that commemorated their first meeting had evolved into a public event that brought together families from across the region who had been served by foundation programs. This year's celebration would be particularly significant because it marked the completion of the family's most ambitious project, a comprehensive support center for families experiencing separation and reunification. The Martinez Chen Family Center occupied a renovated warehouse in Georgetown, transformed into a welcoming space that provided everything from legal services to counseling to practical support like childcare and transportation. The center's innovative approach addressed the full spectrum of challenges that complicated family relationships, from economic instability to immigration issues to the complex emotions surrounding adoption and reunion. Standing in the center's main gathering space as community members arrived for the anniversary celebration, Michael reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them all together. The young executive who had once defined himself primarily through corporate achievement had learned that true success came from understanding how individual privilege could be leveraged to create opportunities for others. Maria moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who had found her calling, greeting families she had worked with and checking on children whose medical care she had coordinated. Her approach to her work reflected the integration of personal experience with professional expertise, treating each family's situation with the nuanced understanding that came from having lived through similar complexities herself. David's conversation with a group of refugee fathers revealed his remarkable ability to connect across cultural and linguistic barriers, sharing technical knowledge while respecting the wisdom that came from lived experience. His engineering solutions were effective precisely because they emerged from genuine partnership with the communities they served. Robert's presence at the celebration was quieter but no less meaningful, as he moved through conversations with the gracious attention of someone who understood that listening was often more valuable than speaking. His decades of business leadership had taught him to recognize potential in unexpected places, a skill that served him well in foundation work. As the formal program began, Michael took the stage to address the assembled community. His remarks were brief but powerful, acknowledging how far they had all traveled while recognizing the ongoing challenges that required continued commitment and innovation. 10 years ago, a simple act of workplace justice set in motion a series of events that changed our understanding of family, responsibility, and the power of individual choices to create systematic change, Michael said to the gathering. What we've learned is that healing happens in community, that families come in many forms, and that the privileges we inherit carry obligations to ensure that others have access to similar opportunities. The celebration continued into the evening, with families sharing stories of reunification, community members describing how foundation programs had supported them through difficult transitions, and young people who had aged out of foster care, talking about their educational and career achievements. As the event concluded and people began to head home, the core family gathered one final time in the center's quiet administrative offices. The building around them represented the culmination of years of intentional work, but more importantly, It represented their commitment to ensuring that other families would have access to the support systems that had made their own healing possible. Maria was the first to speak, her voice carrying the wisdom that came from years of serving communities. Facing impossible choices. This center exists because we learned that individual healing and social justice are inseparable. Every family we serve reminds us that love is stronger than separation, that truth is more powerful than convenient fiction, and that second chances are possible even when they seem impossible. David's contribution reflected his engineers' understanding of systems and sustainability. We built something here that will outlast all of us, something that addresses root causes rather than just symptoms. But more than that, we created a model that other communities can adapt to their own needs and circumstances. Michael felt the weight of stewardship that came with privilege and opportunity. This work has taught me that success isn't measured by what you achieve for yourself, but by what you make possible for others. Our family story gave us unique insights into the challenges facing other families, and this center represents our commitment to sharing those insights in ways that create lasting change. Robert's final words carried the perspective that came from having witnessed decades of social change. What you've built here demonstrates that the most powerful philanthropy grows out of personal experience and authentic commitment to justice. Your willingness to transform private pain into public service has created healing opportunities that will benefit families for generations. As they prepared to leave the center and return to their respective homes, each family member carried with them the satisfaction that came from meaningful work and the anticipation of continued challenges ahead. The Martinez Chen Family Center would open its doors to families in need the following week, but their work was far from finished. Walking into the Seattle night, Michael Chen Martinez felt the deep peace that came from understanding his place in both his immediate family and the broader community they had committed to serve. The chance encounter that had begun their journey toward reunion had evolved into a legacy of service that would continue long after their individual stories had ended. Their transformation from strangers connected by unknown biology to a family committed to social justice had proven that the most powerful changes often begin with simple acts of courage in ordinary moments. The young executive who had once defended a janitor from workplace bullying had learned that true leadership meant creating conditions where everyone could thrive, regardless of their circumstances or challenges. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.